Let's talk about the common causes of heavy bleeding, how it's diagnosed, what the conventional treatments are, and what we can do naturally as well. Hi, I'm Dr. Bala. I'm a naturopathic doctor and I specialize in women's hormonal health. I'm here to help you get periods that you don't have to worry about and that you don't need to rely on birth control for. So make sure to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a video. The most common thing that I hear in my calls with women, especially women who are dealing with heavy bleeding, is that they go to their doctor and they're told that if you have heavy bleeding, that's just part of having periods. Like, that's normal. And they get lab testing done and they're like, well, everything looks fine. You might have a fibroid, you might have a polyp, but your labs look fine. It's just a part of having a period. And I need you to know this is not normal. If you are bleeding through your pads and your tampons and your period cups every hour, if you're passing really big clots, if you are stuck in your house for the first couple of days of your period, if you're afraid to go anywhere, if you are searching for the nearest bathroom the second you leave your house, none of that is normal. You shouldn't have to have a period that feels that way. And often when you go to your doctor, they tell you, okay, we'll just take birth control. And if you don't want birth control, they're like, well, you can get pregnant or get a hysterectomy. These are your options for heavy bleeding. How is that okay? That is not okay. And that's what I'm here to tell you, is that there are a lot of other things that we can do, because there is a huge issue when we're looking at heavy bleeding, and it comes down to estrogen metabolism. I want to start by chatting about a case of a woman that I worked with who came to me with severe period pain and really heavy periods. She was not leaving her house for days at a time. She had to cancel work because she was in so much pain and she was bleeding through everything. She was like, all I could do is be curled up on the couch. I can't move. I can't think. I can't work. I can't go anywhere for 3 to 5 days every single month. And then the pain leading up to her cycles was even more than that. So she's like, I have like 2 good weeks out of every month and I just don't want to keep living like this. That's what she came to me with. We got labs done, which, by the way, her doctors all told her she was fine. She was normal. We later found out she had endometriosis, which is where the severe pain was coming from. And we ran labs together. Her progesterone levels were really low. Her estrogen levels were really high. And we found out she had a lot of gut dysbiosis going on. So we started addressing those. And within 6 months, within 6 cycles, her progesterone levels doubled, her estrogen levels cut in half, and her bleeding was down to just a few days, where she was like, I only have to change my tampon like every 4 or 5 hours, which was huge. She was changing it every hour and she couldn't leave her house. And she found that her period pain was not as intense anymore. She did have endo, so she did still have a little bit of pain, but she was working with another doctor to, talk about other options in that regard. But she was able to get her pain from 1 to 2 weeks every cycle to just a couple of days throughout her cycle. And that bleeding went down. She was basically able to leave her house again. And so she was so excited about that. And that happened within only 6 months. So let's talk about what we did for her. But I first want to talk about, how do you know if you have heavy bleeding? Because a lot of people I work with will tell me that they don't think their periods are that heavy. And when I ask more questions, they realize like, oh, I didn't know I had a heavy bleed. I thought this was normal. I thought everyone was bleeding like this. So if you're losing more than 80 milliliters of blood in your full period, if you use a cup, that's going to be the easiest way of counting milliliters. If you're using pads or tampons, but super tampons and pads are going to hold anywhere from 10 to 12 milliliters. So if you're fully saturating one of those, count how many times you're saturating them. A regular is going to hold anywhere from 7 to 10 milliliters, and a light is going to hold anywhere from 3 to 5. So count how many of these tampons and pads you are using within each of your periods and see approximately how many milliliters of blood you're losing. And if you're using a cup or a disc, those are a lot easier to track because you can see how much each of those hold. So if you're losing more than 80 milliliters of blood, that is a sign that you are having heavy bleeding. If you are going through a pad, a tampon, or any other period product more than every hour or 2, if you're filling them up, that's a sign you're bleeding too much. If your periods are lasting longer than 7 days, that is another sign you are bleeding too much. If you have clots that are bigger than the size of a quarter, that is a sign you are bleeding too heavy. And if you are having to wake up in the middle of the night to change your period products because you're bleeding through, that is another sign that you are bleeding heavy. And lastly, if you are doubling up on anything, if you are using a pad and a tampon, if you're wearing period underwear with your cup because you are afraid of leaking through, that is usually a sign that you are bleeding heavy. So if you checked yes to any of these, you might have heavy bleeding and you didn't even realize it. So there are a lot of reasons why you might have heavy bleeding. Hormonal imbalances, most commonly what I see with women who have really heavy periods and really long periods is that your estrogen levels are really high. Your body is having a hard time getting rid of estrogen through your liver and your gut. If you haven't watched the video on how this is happening, go check that out. So hormonal imbalances are going to include high levels of estrogen and low levels of progesterone. I often see these two go hand in hand. You can have low progesterone without high estrogen, and you can have high estrogen without low progesterone, but I often see if you're struggling with really heavy bleeding that they go hand in hand. You have both, which is a fun little combo to have, right? Or your inflammatory levels might be really high, or again, you might have all three of those going on. Another common cause of heavy bleeding is going to be fibroids or polyps, adenomyosis, endometriosis. Any of these can be causing you to be bleeding more. And I often find those rooted in high estrogen levels. High estrogen is going to make any of these issues worse. The reason that you have cysts or polyps or fibroids is because your estrogen levels were so high and they kept stimulating that tissue. So that is why we have to, again, look at what are your estrogen levels doing? How is your progesterone doing? Because progesterone is what is responsible for offsetting estrogen. If your progesterone isn't high enough, estrogen is just going unchecked. She's doing her thing. She's like, la, 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 no one's paying attention to me. Progesterone comes in to be like, hold on, we got to slow your roll. So if you don't have enough progesterone to be the bearer of bad news to estrogen, then you're going to start having symptoms of estrogen dominance, and one of those is heavy bleeding. Thyroid dysfunction, hypothyroidism, or even Hashimoto's. I've seen both of these cause issues with heavy bleeding or irregular bleeding. Today we're talking about heavy bleeding, so we're just going to get into that, but make sure your thyroid is getting checked. Make sure those thyroid antibodies are getting checked. Clotting disorders. Has your doctor worked you up for a clotting disorder? I have worked with a handful of women who their doctor didn't work them up for a clotting disorder, and they had really heavy bleeding, and they were like, I've tried all the things. All of my other symptoms went away. I don't have any PMS, but I'm still having heavy bleeding. And we found out they had a clotting disorder. Nutrient deficiencies. Low iron is, of course, going to be associated with heavy bleeding because you are losing so much blood. Sometimes it's hard to say if it's chicken or the egg. Was it the heavy bleeding that caused the low iron? Is the low iron making the heavy bleeding worse? It might end up being a cycle. So figuring out if you are anemic and addressing that is going to be really helpful, at least for your energy levels, while we work on how can we get you to stop bleeding so much. Then we're going to look at inflammatory levels, your gut health. Gut dysbiosis, like I talked about with this case that I worked on, her gut had a lot of issues and we had to address that. And within a couple of cycles of addressing that, her period already started to get lighter and less painful. So it happens really quickly when we start addressing the gut, but we have to look at the gut. If you're dealing with gas, bloating, indigestion, constipation, meaning you're not pooping every day, or you're pooping every day, but it's not a full evacuation or well-formed, any of these are a sign that we need to look at what's going on in the gut, because that is how you are getting your estrogen out. Again, go watch that video if you haven't yet, because it's going to give you a lot more detail on how to understand how to look at your hormones. So now let's talk about conventional treatment. So if you go to your doctor, you have heavy bleeding, here are the things that you might have been given, or here, if you haven't gone and you're considering going, here's what they may offer you. The first thing is always birth control. They're going to tell you, have you tried birth control? And if you have, then they'll say, okay, let's move on to the next thing. If you haven't tried it, they're going to give you the different options for birth control. They're going to start with the pill. You can do the progestin only pill. You can do the combo pill with estrogen and progestins. They'll give you the IUD. There are lots of different options that you can do, different forms of birth control that are going to help slow down the bleeding, because we're stopping your period from happening. You're not ovulating anymore when you're on birth control, so you don't have that period anymore, so you don't have the heavy periods. The next option they might give you is an NSAID, which is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory like ibuprofen, Tylenol, these kind of things. That is going to help with, again, that inflammation, and it may help to thin out the blood a little bit and help with slowing down the bleeding a bit. It's not addressing the root cause, and you can only take NSAIDs for so long before you then develop stomach ulcers. So consider that. And then lastly, if you can't do any of these, you might also be told, get pregnant or get a hysterectomy. So your options are a little bit limited when it comes to heavy bleeding. Most often, they're really going to try and push you towards different types of birth control. The IUD is the most common one that I see being prescribed for heavy bleeding. So you don't want to do any of those. You're like, okay, Dr. Bala, what can I do instead? I really don't want to have to get a hysterectomy. I don't want to take chronic NSAIDs. I don't want to be on birth control. What else is there that I can do? You might have also heard your doctor talk about tranexamic acid. This is another option. It's a little bit more kind of in the middle of the road. It's not super conventional, not super natural either. And it helps to slow down the bleeding, and it can help for a short period of time. I often see that a lot of women, they'll take this, it helps with the bleeding, but then it comes back. because we're not addressing the underlying cause of why you're having heavy bleeding. Remember that, okay? So tranexamic acid can be helpful short term, but we need to address that underlying factor of why is your body not getting rid of that estrogen? Where are these inflammatory levels coming from? Do you have something like a fibroid? How can we help to shrink those? How can we help to make sure you're not growing more? And then lastly, you might have heard the option being given for a DNC, which is essentially, or an ablation, which is essentially going in and kind of burning off the inner layer of your endometrium. And again, these are short-term treatments. They will last for 6 months, 9 months, and then you start having heavy bleeding again because we're not addressing the root cause. So what can we do to address a root cause? Let's talk about a few different natural options. My first thing that I always start with, and then I started with this woman who came to me with her heavy bleeding, was looking at her progesterone levels. And remember, her progesterone levels were at 9. I like to see them above 15. But when we were done, after 6 months, they doubled. They were at 19. They more than doubled. So it is possible to see them increase and improve naturally. We didn't add any progesterone for her. We didn't add any HRT. We didn't do anything prescription for her. We did everything natural, lifestyle. We worked on her gut. So that's the first thing that we're going to do is if you have dysbiosis, like I mentioned before, any of those symptoms of going on in your gut, we're going to want to address those. Then we can start supporting your progesterone levels. There are different herbs we can use. There are different nutrients we're going to want to include, right? If you're not getting enough healthy fats and if you're not getting enough protein in your diet, these are going to be the biggest building blocks of our hormones. You're not giving your hormones the building blocks they need to be made in your body. So protein, healthy fats, these are very, very important. 30 grams of protein per meal, so at least 90 to 100 grams per day is what I want you to be shooting for if you are looking to support your periods. And I want you to be shooting for about 10 grams of healthy fats per day. Other things that we want to include to support progesterone are going to be methylated B vitamins. Any of those B vitamins, I often just recommend a multivitamin because it's going to have all of those B vitamins in there already. Magnesium is also really important for so many different functions in our liver, in our gut, in our adrenal glands, in our brain, for stress, so many different things. And we have Vitex as well, chaste tree berry. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this. Vitex is a very common one, especially if you've ever Googled low progesterone, you're going to see Vitex pop up. And I love using this. I typically will cycle it 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or just follicular phase only or luteal phase only, either one of those. But having that cycle can often help to get the rhythm going in your body again to help support a healthy ovulation. Then we're going to talk about how can we balance that estrogen metabolism in your body. We can start with cruciferous veggies. I worked with another girl who had really bad period pain and PMS, and she was like, I would drink a kale smoothie every day, and that helped my period symptoms. She's like, I swear that helped my estrogen dominance. So having cruciferous veggies on a daily basis can be really, really helpful for you for that, because cruciferous veggie turns into what's called DIM. And DIM supports specifically a couple of different pathways in our liver that help with estrogen metabolism. So you can take DIM, but start with the veggies first. Then we want to support our liver with things like NAC, milk thistle, dandelion root tea. I love all of them. It really just depends where your symptoms are at, and that's kind of what, when we work together, we'll figure that out. But there's a long list of things we can do to support your liver. Those are my top 3 favorite ones. Then we can also consider things like phytoestrogens, things like soy, flax, seed cycling are all going to be really beneficial for you as well. Then we're going to work on reducing inflammation. Things that are anti-inflammatory are going to be reducing sugar in your diet, reducing dairy, making sure you're eating whole foods, making sure that you are getting plenty of water, you're helping to flush things out. All of these are going to be very important for supporting that inflammation in your body as well. Then we also can consider things like ginger and curcumin. Both of these are very anti-inflammatory. Ginger has been studied next to NSAIDs and been as painful as ibuprofen in helping with period pain management. So I know we're talking about heavy bleeding, but ginger can be a really powerful anti-inflammatory when taken in higher doses. You're going to want to shoot the studies that were done at the dose of 500 milligrams, like 2 to 3 times a day. And then lastly, we've got herbal support. So these are a little bit more spot treatment, right? They are herbal ways to support your bleeding, but not necessarily getting to the root cause. So things like yarrow and shepherd's purse are my 2 favorite herbs that are going to help slow down the bleeding. I work with a lot of women with heavy bleeding, and yarrow is my go-to for this because while we're working on these underlying pieces, they might take a couple of cycles to change. And in the meantime, how can we get you some relief? Let's slow down that bleeding. Yarrow and shepherd's purse are my 2 favorite for these. And you're going to have to take them more often than not, okay? So yarrow, you're going to take yarrow or shepherd's purse, you're going to take before you start bleeding 3 times a day. for like 3 to 5 days. And then when you're bleeding, you're going to have to take it every 3 hours. So it's a high dosing, but it helps to really slow down that bleeding. I know heavy periods can be disrupting. I know they interfere with your life and keep you at home, and they keep you stuck, and they keep you scared about what your next period is going to be like. So if you need help with this, go schedule a discovery call. I love working on heavy bleeding, and I want you to have periods that you don't have to worry about anymore. So go schedule a call, go subscribe. Those are free, and they help me create more videos. I will see you next week.